The rain had been falling since early evening, and by midnight it showed no sign of relenting. It came down in heavy, deliberate curtains against the tall glass panels flanking the entrance of the Ashworth Grand Hotel, streaking the windows in long, trembling lines that blurred the city lights beyond into something impressionist and cold. The kind of rain that didn't ask permission, the kind that settled in and made itself permanent, turning gutters into rivers and awnings into percussion instruments, and the whole sprawling cityscape into a smeared watercolor of headlights and neon and wet black asphalt reflecting everything twice. Inside the lobby held its warmth with the deliberate ease of a place designed to make warmth look effortless. Chandelier light pooled golden across marble floors veined in gray and cream. Table lamps near the reception desk cast soft amber shadows against dark wood paneling that had been polished so thoroughly it seemed to breathe. The occasional sound of a key card being programmed. The whisper of a uniformed attendant crossing from one station to another with the practiced silence of someone who understood that in a hotel of this caliber, the staff existed best when they existed least. The doorman stood at his post near the revolving entrance with the studied stillness of a man who had learned years ago not to notice things, not to notice the hours, not to notice the particular guests who arrived late and departed early, not to notice the weight that certain names carried when they appeared on the reservation system. He was paid well for this talent. The hotel was paid well for cultivating it. Dominic Hale did not notice the quiet. He moved through environments like this the way water moves through familiar ground, without resistance, without ceremony, without the need to announce itself or explain the direction of its flow. He came through the main entrance at 8 minutes past midnight, his black suit unwrinkled despite the hour collar open at the throat, his dark hair slightly damp at the edges from the brief passage between car and door. The rain had barely touched him. It rarely did. On his hands and along his neck, tattoos surfaced at the borders of his clothing. Deliberate marks, unhurried in their placement, accumulated over a life that most people in this marble lobby would not survive a single chapter of. They were not decorative. They were biographical. Each one a closed chapter in a language most people couldn't read and didn't want to. Two men followed him at a respectful distance. They always did. The first was Brennan, who had worked with Dominic for 11 years across 3 cities and an uncountable number of rooms where careful words were exchanged and permanent decisions were reached. Brennan was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that had communicated nothing unless Dominic needed it to communicate something. The second was Connell, quieter, positioned closer to the entrance, maintaining the perimeter, the way a man maintains a perimeter when the perimeter is his entire professional identity. The staff noticed Dominic the way trained staff always noticed men like him, carefully, peripherally, without making it obvious that they were noticing at all. He had stayed here before. He had held meetings in the private suites upstairs. He was a guest with a reservation and a black card that never declined, and a name that the night manager had flagged in the system with a small notation that simply read, "Full accommodation, no questions." That was enough. That was all they needed to know. Dominic's mind was already 14 floors above the lobby. The meeting waiting for him involved a property dispute, 3 investors, 1 contract, and a disagreement that had quietly outgrown the ability of lawyers and arbitrators to contain it. Dominic had been called in not as a lawyer or a mediator, but as the kind of presence that made disagreements resolve faster. He was thinking through the variables as he crossed the lobby floor, cataloging the angles the way he always did, calculating what each man in that room wanted badly enough to compromise over. He was not thinking about the bench near the entrance. He was not thinking about anything in the lobby at all, until he was. It was something in his peripheral vision that slowed him first. Not a sound, not a movement, but the specific wrongness of a small shape in a place where small shapes did not belong at this hour. Like a note played in the wrong key. The eye caught it before the mind identified it, and by the time the mind caught up, the body had already begun responding. Dominic's pace didn't stop immediately. It reduced, became deliberate. His eyes moved left. A little girl. She sat on a wooden bench positioned near the glass wall by the entrance, close enough that the rain light played across her face in shifting silver patterns. She was perhaps 6 years old, small, even for that, dressed in an olive green jacket that had been worn enough to soften at the elbows and collar. The kind of jacket that had been bought with care and maintained with the particular attention of a parent who could not afford to replace it. Beneath it, a knitted scarf the color of wheat was looped loosely around her neck. Her boots were brown, slightly scuffed at the toes, of laces tied in the double-knotted style of a child who had been taught to tie them tightly so they wouldn't come undone. In her arms, held against her chest with both hands, the way a much younger child holds a stuffed animal, was a purple backpack. Compact, faded at the edges, its zipper pull catching the chandelier light in small, intermittent flashes. She held it the way you hold something when it's the only familiar thing in an unfamiliar place. She was not crying, she was not looking around the room for someone. She was not fidgeting or talking to herself, or doing any of the things a child alone at midnight in a hotel lobby might reasonably be expected to do. She was simply sitting, still, in the way that children almost never are. Not the stillness of sleep or distraction or the momentary pause between one burst of energy and the next. This was the stillness of someone who had learned to wait without expecting the wait to be short. The stillness of practice, of repetition, of a lesson absorbed so thoroughly that it had become posture. Dominic stopped. He stood for a moment studying her from a few meters away. In his line of work, he had learned to distinguish between people performing calm and people who had arrived at calm through necessity. This child had not been coached into sitting quietly. She had arrived here on her own through something she had already lived through, already understood at an age when understanding should not yet carry this kind of weight. His two men stopped when he stopped. Brennan exchanged a glance with Connell, but said nothing. Dominic walked toward her. He did not loom. He did not approach with the full architecture of his height, which would have cast a shadow across her that might have frightened her. Instead, he lowered himself, crouching down until he was level with her, his forearms resting across his knees, his tattooed hands loosely clasped in front of him. The posture was careful, considered, though he could not have said where he had learned it. Some things the body remembers that the mind has filed away in rooms it no longer visits. The girl looked up at him. She did not flinch. That surprised him. Most adults in his proximity found reasons to look away. This child simply looked at him with dark, steady eyes. Not fearless exactly, but composed in a way that suggested she had already evaluated him and decided something. "Where are your parents?" Dominic asked. His voice came out quieter than he had intended. "My mommy is working," the girl said. She said it simply without complaint, the way you state a fact that has been true for long enough that it no longer requires emotional annotation. Dominic glanced once toward the reception desk, then back at her. "And your father?" The girl gave a small, definitive shake of her head, the kind of shake that meant more than not here. The kind that meant, that is a different kind of question, and I am not going to answer it. "What's your name?" "Lily." "Lily," he said at once, the way he repeated names when he was committing them to memory. "How long have you been sitting here?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, the way children consider questions that adults treat as casual. She looked at the windows, at the rain, at the chandelier, as though triangulating her answer from the available evidence. "A long time," she decided. He nodded slowly. Then he asked again, more gently, "Where is your mommy working right now?" Lily's chin lifted slightly. She pointed upward, past the chandelier, past the ceiling, toward the floors above them. "In this hotel," she said. Then after a pause, so brief it almost didn't register, "My mommy is sick." Her voice stayed level. Her posture stayed unchanged. Her steady dark eyes stayed unchanged. "And her boss refused to pay her." Dominic Hale did not move. The lobby continued its manufactured quiet around them. The soft keystrokes at the front desk, the rain against the glass, the distant whisper of the elevator opening on an upper floor. Everything exactly as it had been 60 seconds ago, except that Dominic was no longer thinking about the meeting upstairs. He was thinking about a little girl who had learned how to wait, and about who had taught her. Dominic did not stand up immediately. He stayed crouched in front of her at her level, as though standing too quickly might break something fragile that had only just formed between them. Something that was not yet trust, but was adjacent to it. "Her boss refused to pay her," he repeated slowly. Not a question. He was testing the weight of the words, letting them settle into him properly. Lily nodded. One small, certain movement. "How do you know that?" Dominic asked. She looked down at the purple backpack in her arms for a moment, as though deciding how much of the story was hers to tell. Then she looked back up at him. "I heard her crying." Dominic said nothing. On the phone, Lily continued, this afternoon, before she came to work. She was talking to someone and she kept saying sorry. A small pause. Mommy doesn't usually say sorry that many times. There was no drama in how she delivered this. No wobbling lip, no performance of sadness. She stated it the way a child states a fact they have already spent considerable time alone with. Turned it over, examined it, set it down somewhere inside themselves where it wouldn't keep shifting. That restraint was the saddest thing Dominic had encountered in a considerable amount of time. What's your mother's name? He asked. Grace, Lily said. Then after a breath, Grace Whitfield. But everyone here calls her Gracie. Does she know you're sitting down here? Lily's eyes dropped briefly. She thinks I'm upstairs, in the staff room. A beat. But it smelled funny in there and nobody was in it. She pulled the backpack tighter against her chest. I didn't want to be in a room by myself. So she had come down here instead. To a lobby full of strangers, to a wooden bench beside a rain-streaked window. Because a room full of strangers felt less lonely than an empty room. Dominic understood that particular mathematics more intimately than he wished to. How long has your mother been sick? He asked. Since before Christmas, she said. But she said it's getting better. A small furrow appeared between her brows. She says that a lot, that things are getting better. Do you believe her? Lily looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Dominic felt it. I believe she wants them too, Lily said finally. Dominic held her gaze and felt something old and unannounced move through his chest. It wasn't pity. He had learned young that pity was a useless currency, heavy to carry and worthless when spent. This was something older than pity, something closer to recognition. His mother had said things were getting better too. She had said it in a room not unlike a staff room. Small, fluorescent lit, smelling of industrial cleaner and recycled air. She had said it while pulling her hair back before a night shift, while checking that young Dominic had something to eat, while pretending that the cough she had developed was seasonal and temporary and nothing to worry about. He had believed she wanted them to too. Dominic stood up slowly, not because the conversation was over, but because he needed a moment where the girl couldn't see his face clearly. He turned slightly, the way a man turns to look at nothing in particular when what he actually needs is for his expression to reset. Brennan caught his eye from across the lobby. Dominic gave him a look that communicated nothing visible to anyone else but communicated everything to Brennan. The man gave a small nod and reached for his phone. Dominic turned back to Lily. Has your mother worked here long? He asked, his voice level again. 2 years, Lily said. She really likes it. She says the hotel is beautiful. She glanced around the lobby with the frank, unhurried assessment of a child seeing something as it actually is. It is beautiful, she agreed, as though confirming her mother's taste was sound. Despite everything, something almost moved across Dominic's face. She hasn't been paid, he said quietly. For how long? I don't know exactly. Lily's brows drew together. But she had to borrow money from Mrs. Pemberton next door to buy my lunch things last week. A pause. And Mommy doesn't like borrowing. She said this with a particular weight, as though the borrowing had troubled Grace more deeply than the hunger it had prevented. She told Mrs. Pemberton she'd pay her back on Friday, but Friday came and she still hadn't been paid. So she called the hotel, and the man said, Lily stopped. What did the man say? Dominic asked. That she missed days, that it was her fault. Lily's voice stayed even, but something behind her eyes shifted. But she didn't miss days because she wanted to. She missed days because she was sick. And when you're sick, you can't help it. She said this with the absolute moral clarity that only children possess. That clean, uncluttered certainty about what is fair and what is not, uncorrupted by the explanations adults construct to make unfairness livable. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been sharpening itself since she first looked up at him from this bench. The man who told her that, the one who refused to pay her. His voice was careful, measured. Is he the manager of this hotel? Lily nodded. Dominic straightened fully. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket once, a small, precise movement, and glanced toward the elevator at the far end of the lobby. He thought about the meeting upstairs, the investors, the property dispute. Then he thought about Grace Whitfield, borrowing money from a neighbor for school lunches, coming to work sick because The alternative was losing everything, crying on the phone and apologizing while her daughter listened through a door. The meeting could wait. "Stay here," he told Lily. "Don't move from this bench." She looked up at him. "Are you going to help my mommy?" Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. "I'm going to make a phone call," he said quietly. It wasn't an answer, but somehow Lily seemed to understand that it was. The hotel manager's name was Martin Driscoll. Dominic learned this in under 4 minutes, the time it took Brennan to make 2 phone calls and cross the lobby with the information delivered in a low, efficient murmur. Martin Driscoll, 43 years old, 12 years in hospitality management, 7 months in his current role at the Ashworth Grand. Dominic absorbed this without expression and told Brennan to have the man brought downstairs. He did not phrase it as a request. While he waited, Dominic returned to the bench where Lily sat. He didn't crowd her. He positioned himself a short distance away, close enough that she wasn't alone, far enough that she had space. He had learned somewhere in a life that had not made such lessons easy, that people who were already carrying something heavy did not need the additional weight of someone else's proximity pressing in on them. Lily had her backpack open, now small hands rummaging through it with the focused seriousness of a child conducting an inventory. She produced a slightly bent granola bar, examined it, and began eating it in careful, measured bites. Not the bites of a child savoring a treat, the bites of a child making something last. Dominic watched her without appearing to. It occurred to him that this was likely her dinner. The elevator at the far end of the lobby opened 7 minutes after Brennan's call. Martin Driscoll stepped out, looking the way men look when they've been pulled from somewhere comfortable unexpectedly. Jacket slightly creased, expression arranged into professional pleasantness, but not quite reaching the eyes. He was a broad man, thick through the shoulders, with a particular confidence of someone who had managed people for a living and had grown accustomed to that small authority, feeling like real authority. He scanned the lobby, found Dominic, and approached with his hand already extended. "Good evening, sir. I understand you wanted to speak with management." "Grace Whitfield," Dominic said. He did not take the hand. Driscoll's extended arm completed its journey to nowhere and returned to his side. The professional pleasantness recalibrated. "I'm sorry, Grace Whitfield," Dominic repeated. "She works in this hotel, night cleaning staff. She hasn't been paid." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'd like to understand why." Something moved behind Driscoll's eyes. A quick internal calculation, the kind that happens when a man tries to determine how much the person in front of him actually knows. Then the professional pleasantness reasserted itself. Smoother this time. "I see. Well, I appreciate your concern, but employee payroll matters are confidential by nature, and without knowing your relationship to—" "Consider me interested," Dominic said. "That's enough relationship for tonight." Driscoll studied him. Dominic held his gaze without effort, without aggression. Just held it the way a wall holds space. "Mrs. Whitfield has had some attendance issues over the past several weeks. Our payroll system is structured around verified hours, and when hours cannot be confirmed due to absences—" "She was sick," Dominic said. "That may be, but the hotel has procedures." "She was sick," Dominic said again, quieter this time. "And she still came in." Driscoll paused. "How many weeks of wages are being withheld?" Another calculation behind the eyes. "I'm not in a position to discuss specific—" "How many weeks?" The question arrived without volume and without warmth, and it landed the way such questions land when delivered by men who have never needed to raise their voice to be taken seriously. Driscoll felt it. Dominic watched him feel it. "There may be," Driscoll said more slowly now, 3 to 4 weeks of disputed wages. Under review." Dominic said nothing. He had already taken his phone from his jacket pocket. He held it at his side screen, facing away from Driscoll, and pressed record. "Disputed by whom?" Dominic asked. "By the department, based on attendance records." "Has she been given written documentation of these disputes?" Driscoll shifted his weight slightly. "The standard process involves—" "Has she been given written documentation, yes or no?" A beat. "The process is ongoing." Dominic looked at him for a long moment. In the silence, the rain against the glass was very audible. He was watching Driscoll the way he watched everyone in rooms like this. Not for what they said, but for what happened in the spaces between the words. And what was happening in those spaces was not the discomfort of a manager caught in a bureaucratic oversight. It was something else, something that moved differently faster with too much awareness behind it. The man was not embarrassed. He was careful. There was a significant difference. Mrs. Whitfield has a daughter, Dominic said. He did not look toward the bench. Approximately 6 years old. The child has been sitting alone in this lobby for, he checked his watch, at minimum an hour and a half. While her mother works a shift, she is physically unwell to be completing, because she was told that missing another shift would cost her the job. Driscoll's jaw tightened fractionally. Was she threatened with termination? I wouldn't characterize. Was she told she would lose her job if she missed another shift? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Dominic looked at the man, really looked at him, and felt the shape of something he couldn't name yet harden in the back of his mind. In his experience, guilt presented in predictable ways. Defensiveness, justification, the rapid stacking of reasons. Driscoll was doing all of those things, but underneath them, something else was operating. We're not finished, Dominic said. His voice carried no threat. It didn't need to. I'll want to continue this conversation shortly. Don't leave the hotel. Driscoll gave a short, stiff nod and turned back toward the elevator with the careful walk of a man concentrating on appearing unhurried. Dominic watched him go. Then he stood quietly in the middle of the marble lobby phone, still recording in his hand, and thought about a man who was too nervous for someone who had simply failed to process a paycheck. Too nervous by a significant amount. And that in Dominic Hale's considerable experience meant only one thing. There was something underneath this, and he was going to find it. Dominic returned to the bench. Lily had finished the granola bar and folded the wrapper into a precise small square, the way children do when they have been taught to be tidy and have taken the lesson seriously. She held the folded wrapper in her palm, spotted a bin across the lobby, glanced at Dominic, then slid off the bench to dispose of it. She came back and climbed back up onto the bench with the quiet self-sufficiency of a child accustomed to managing small things alone. Dominic sat beside her this time. Not close, just present. The man you spoke to, Lily said without looking at him, the big one. Yes. He has a mean face, she said simply, even when he's smiling. Dominic looked at her. You notice that? Mommy told me to pay attention to faces, Lily said. She says people's faces tell you things their words don't. Your mother sounds like a smart woman. Lily nodded with the solemn certainty of someone confirming an established fact. She's the smartest person I know. A pause. She knows all the words to every song on the radio, even the fast ones. Something shifted in Dominic's chest, a movement so quiet he almost missed it. He looked away. He turned to Brennan, who had maintained his position at a discreet distance throughout. He spoke quietly. Go upstairs. Service floors 8 through 14. Find Grace Whitfield, night cleaning staff. He paused. Be careful how you approach her. Don't frighten her. Brennan nodded and moved toward the elevator without a word. Dominic looked back at Lily. Someone is going to check on your mother, he said. Lily looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts relief and something more complicated. The particular wariness of a child who has been told things were being handled before and has learned to withhold full belief until evidence arrives. Okay, she said carefully. They sat in silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the rain had shifted character. Less aggressive now, more persistent. The lobby had grown quieter still. Lily swung her legs slowly from the bench boots, not quite reaching the floor. Do you work here? She asked. No, Dominic said. Then why are you still here? She asked it without accusation, genuinely curious. Dominic considered the question more seriously than she probably expected him to. Because something needed to be looked into, he said finally, and I was the one standing here. Lily appeared to find this acceptable. 4 minutes passed, then Dominic's phone buzzed. A single message from Brennan. 3 words. Come up. Now. Dominic stood. He looked at Lily and made a rapid assessment. Leaving her alone again was not something he was willing to do. He signaled Connell and spoke to him in a low, direct tone. Stay with the child. Don't leave her line of sight. If she needs anything, get it. Connell moved to a position nearby without comment. Dominic looked down at Lily. I need to go upstairs for a few minutes. This man is going to stay close by. His name is Connell. He's safe. He held her gaze. I'll be back. Lily looked at Connell with her mother's taught assessment taking in his face, his posture, whatever language those things spoke to her. Then she looked back at Dominic. Okay, she said, this time without the weariness. Dominic moved. He took the elevator to the 11th floor and followed the service corridor east where Brennan was waiting outside a suite with the door partially open. The expression on Brennan's face was the careful blankness of a man suppressing a reaction because the moment didn't call for one. Dominic pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The suite's main room was dim lit only by the light spilling from the bathroom and the ambient glow of the city through the large windows. A cleaning trolley stood near the center of the room, slightly askew as though it had been abandoned mid-movement. A spray bottle had fallen to the carpet. Grace Whitfield was on the floor beside it. She was conscious. Barely. Sitting with her back against the side of the bed, knees drawn up, one hand pressed flat against the carpet, as though she had been trying to push herself upright and hadn't been able to finish the effort. She was a slight woman younger than Dominic had expected, with dark circles beneath her eyes so deep they looked like bruising. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each inhale a negotiation between her lungs and whatever was occupying them. Her uniform was neat despite everything, even on the floor at 1 in the morning, with her body finally refusing the terms she had been imposing on it. The collar was straight. She had maintained the presentation even as the structure beneath it collapsed. She looked up when Dominic entered, and the first thing she said was, "Lily, is Lily Kus—" "She's downstairs," Dominic said, immediately crossing to her. "She's safe. She's with someone I trust." Grace closed her eyes. The relief that moved across her face was so total and so unguarded that it was almost too private a thing to witness. Dominic crouched beside her. Up close, he could see the tremor in her hands, the tension in her jaw, the shallow work of her breathing, the pallor beneath her skin that had nothing to do with the lighting. "How long have you been on the floor?" he asked quietly. "I don't—" She swallowed with the difficulty. "A little while." "Can you stand—" She started to say yes. Her body answered differently, a sharp wince, a tremor in the arm she tried to push herself up with. "No," Dominic said gently. "Don't." He looked at Brennan. "Call the car. Now." He turned back to Grace and his voice dropped to something that was not softness exactly, but was the closest thing to it that his voice could produce. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, "and then someone is going to explain to me how you ended up on this floor." Grace looked at him with exhausted, bewildered eyes. "Who are you?" Dominic held her gaze. "Someone who was standing in the right place tonight," he said. And then he carefully, deliberately helped Grace Whitfield to her feet, supporting her weight without making it feel like he was carrying her, and did not let go until he was certain she wouldn't fall. The private clinic was 20 minutes from the hotel. Dominic's car covered it in 14. He sat in the front, leaving the back seat to Grace and Lily, who had said nothing when she saw her mother being guided through the lobby. Nothing at all. She had simply slid off the bench and walked directly to her and pressed herself against Grace's side with a fierce, total commitment to contact that required no words. Grace's arm had come around her instantly, automatically, the way breathing is automatic. Connell had retrieved a blanket from somewhere. Dominic didn't ask where. Now Dominic sat with his phone in his hand, watching the rain-blurred city move past the window, and made the first call. The man who answered was named Sawyer. He was not a private investigator in the formal sense. He held no license maintained, no office appeared in no professional directory. What he maintained was an extremely accurate picture of financial movements, personal arrangements, and the quiet agreements that people made when they believed no one credible was paying attention. "Grace Whitfield," Dominic said. "Night cleaning staff, Ashworth Grand Hotel," and the manager Martin Driscoll. "I want everything. Start with Driscoll." "How fast?" "I'm already waiting," Dominic said. He ended the call and watched the city. In the back seat, he could hear Lily's voice, very low, very steady, telling her mother about the granola bar and the bench and the man with the tattoos who had stayed. Grace responded in murmurs. At one point, she made a sound that was not quite a word, and Dominic understood without turning around that she was crying silently in the way adults cry when they are trying not to alarm a child. He looked out the window and said nothing and let them have the darkness of the back seat. The clinic received Grace without bureaucratic friction. Dominic had made a second call during the drive. By the time they arrived, a room was prepared, a physician was present, and no one asked questions about insurance. Lily sat in a chair beside her mother's bed and held Grace's hand with both of hers, her purple backpack on her lap. her small face composed into an expression of determined calm that Dominic recognized from the lobby bench. The same patience, the same careful stillness. Grace had tried twice to tell Dominic he didn't need to stay. He had not responded to this, which she eventually accepted. He positioned himself outside the room in the corridor close enough far enough and waited for Sawyer to call back. The call came 47 minutes later. Dominic listened without speaking for most of it. He asked 3 questions, short ones. Then he thanked Sawyer and ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone hanging at his side. Then he walked to the window at the end of the hall and stood looking out at the rain and processed what he had just been told. Martin Driscoll had been receiving payments, not from the hotel, not from any payroll account or bonus structure or legitimate incentive program, from a private source routed carefully through 2 intermediary accounts that had been set up to look like contractor payments for facility services. The payments had begun 8 months ago. The source, once Sawyer had unraveled the intermediaries, was a man named Keith Nolan, Grace Whitfield's ex-husband. Dominic knew the name within moments of hearing it, not personally but by category. Sawyer filled in the specifics. Keith Nolan, 38 years old, a history of documented incidents, 2 restraining orders, 1 conviction for assault that had been reduced on appeal, a custody case that he had lost comprehensively 18 months ago when Grace presented evidence of his behavior to the family court. The judge had been unambiguous. Full custody to Grace. Supervised visitation rights suspended pending a psychological evaluation that Nolan had declined to complete. He had lost Lily entirely. And he had decided with the particular logic of men like him that if he couldn't take what he wanted directly, he would dismantle the things standing between him and it. The plan as Sawyer laid it out through financial records and intercepted communications was methodical in its cruelty. Nolan had identified Driscoll, a man with manageable debts and flexible ethics, and approached him quietly. The arrangement was simple. Driscoll would delay Grace's wages. He would document her sick days as unauthorized absences. He would increase her workload incrementally. He would keep the pressure calibrated just enough to exhaust her, to destabilize her, to push her toward a point where she could no longer demonstrate to any court that she was capable of providing a stable home. If Grace broke down completely financially, physically, professionally, Nolan would return to court. And this time he would have documented evidence that she couldn't manage. Then Sawyer delivered the final piece, the thing that hardened everything else into iron. Nolan had already contacted an attorney. The paperwork was being prepared. A new custody petition citing Grace's deteriorating financial situation, her documented absences from work, her inability to provide consistent care. He was using the very collapse he had engineered as evidence that she was failing. He was going to walk into a courtroom and point at the rubble he had created and say, "Look, she can't even keep a job." Dominic stood at the window and let this settle into him fully. Outside, the rain had not stopped. The city continued below, indifferent, going about the business of being a city at 2 in the morning. He thought about Grace on the floor of that hotel suite, hand flat against the carpet collar, straight even then. He thought about Lily on the bench folding a granola bar wrapper into a square. He thought about the careful, patient stillness of a child who had learned to wait without expecting the wait to be short, and understood now where that stillness had come from, what had slowly, systematically been constructed around that child to produce it. A man had looked at his own daughter and seen leverage. That was the thing Dominic kept returning to. Not the bribery. Bribery was a transaction, and transactions he understood. Not even the cruelty, the deliberate grinding down of a sick woman through withheld wages and manufactured paperwork. Those were methods. He had seen methods before. What stopped him at the window, what he kept turning over, was the specific coldness required to look at your own child sitting on a bench at midnight and consider that useful. Dominic had known many dangerous men. He was by most reasonable definitions one himself. But there was a particular category of dangerous that had nothing to do with power or violence or the careful management of fear. A category defined only by what a person was willing to treat as expendable. Keith Nolan had placed his 6-year-old daughter in that category. Dominic turned from the window. He walked back down the corridor to Grace's room and looked through the small glass panel in the door. Grace was asleep, or something close to it, finally, after what her body had been refusing to surrender to for weeks. Lily was still in the chair beside her, still holding her mother's hand, her head now resting against the edge of the bed, eyes closed. Still there, still holding on. Dominic looked at them for a long moment. Then he straightened and took out his phone and made the call that would end Martin Driscoll's career before morning. And then he made the other call, the one that would ensure Keith Nolan understood, in terms that required no legal interpretation, that his plan had not merely failed. It had arrived at exactly the wrong person. The corridor was quiet at 3 in the morning. Not the manufactured quiet of the hotel lobby, carpeted and chandelier lit and designed to communicate comfort. This was the functional quiet of a medical facility after hours punctuated only by the soft rhythm of monitoring equipment behind closed doors and the occasional footstep of a night nurse, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned to exist without disturbing the air. Dominic sat in a chair outside Grace's room. He had not sat down in some time. His body had reminded him of this in the small, insistent way bodies remind men who ignore them. A tightness across the shoulders, a weight behind the eyes. He had accepted the chair without acknowledging that he needed it, which was the only way he ever accepted anything that resembled concession. Brennan had positioned himself at the end of the corridor. Connell was downstairs. The clinic's night staff had been professionally incurious about the arrangement, which told Dominic that the physician he'd called had set the right expectations before their arrival. He held his phone and looked at the name on the screen. Edmund Ashworth. He had known Edmund for 19 years across a relationship that had never been entirely comfortable and had never needed to be. Edmund was 71 years old, operated out of Zurich for the purposes of taxation and out of everywhere else for the purposes of everything else, and had assembled over 5 decades a portfolio of holdings so diversified and so deliberately obscured that most financial analysts who tried to map it simply stopped beat at some point and wrote private interests in the space where specifics should have been. Among those private interests was a hotel group. Among that hotel group was the Ashworth Grand. Edmund Ashworth did not know Dominic had been in his hotel tonight. He did not know a woman named Grace Whitfield existed, or that a child had been sitting alone in his lobby at midnight, or that a manager he was paying a considerable salary to had been accepting bribes to destroy a single mother's livelihood on behalf of her abusive ex-husband. He was about to know all of it. Dominic pressed call. It rang 4 times. Then the line opened. Dominic. The voice was alert. Edmund Ashworth had not, as far as Dominic knew, slept easily since his 50s. It's past 3. I know what time it is, Dominic said. A brief pause. This isn't casual. No, he heard the old man shift. A door opening. A quieter room. Tell me, Edmund said. Dominic told him. He was not a man who used more words than necessary, and the account he gave was precise and sequential. The lobby, the child, the conversation with Lily, the exchange with Driscoll, what Sawyer had found in the financial records. He named Keith Nolan. He described the structure of the payments, the intermediary accounts, the 8 months of calibrated destruction. He described Grace Whitfield on the floor of Suite 1107 with her hand flat against the carpet and her collar still straight. He described the custody petition being prepared, Nolan's plan to use Grace's engineered collapse as courtroom evidence. He said that last part once and did not return to it. Edmund listened without interrupting. When Dominic finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Driscoll has been with the hotel 7 months, Edmund said finally. Yes. And Sawyer is certain about the payment routing. Sawyer is always certain, Dominic said. That is what I pay him for. Another silence, shorter. I want the documentation sent to my director of operations within the hour, Edmund said. His voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but the way a room changes when the temperature drops by several degrees without any single identifiable cause. I'll handle the internal process personally. I'd prefer it move faster than a process, Dominic said. It will. A pause. You have my word. I know, Dominic said. That's why I called you instead of handling it myself. This landed the way it was intended to, not as a threat, but as a precise statement of what the alternative had looked like before this call was made. Edmund understood. He had understood Dominic for 19 years. The woman, Edmund said, Grace Whitfield. She's being treated, yes. At your arrangement, yes. A brief pause. I'll have the hotel's insurance coverage applied retroactively, and her wages, all of them, will be transferred before morning. He paused again, and when he spoke next, something in his voice had shifted almost imperceptibly. She should not have been in that position. Not in any building with my name attached to it. Dominic said nothing. He had made his points. They had landed. The ex-husband, Edmund said. Nolan. I'll manage Nolan separately, Dominic said. The old man did not ask how. Is there anything else tonight? Edmund asked. Dominic looked through the glass panel in the door. Grace was still asleep. Lily had shifted in the chair, her head now resting more fully against the mattress. Her grip on her mother's hand maintained even in sleep, fingers loosely interlaced with Grace's, as though even unconsciously she was unwilling to be the one to let go first. No, Dominic said. That's everything for tonight. He ended the call and held the phone in his hands and sat in the functional quiet of the corridor and did not move for a while. He was not a man given to reflection as a practice. His life had been built on forward motion. The next decision, the next room, the next arrangement to be made or unmade. Looking backward was a luxury he had learned early to distrust. But sitting here at 3 in the morning, in a clinic corridor with rain still faintly audible, somewhere beyond the building's walls, he found himself thinking about his mother, about the shifts she had worked while sick, about the wages that had sometimes arrived late or short or not at all, about the small adjustments she had made without complaint, the dinners that were slightly smaller, the heating that was turned down a degree, the careful refolding of things that needed to last longer than they were made to last, about the fact that no one had ever made a single phone call on her behalf. Not one. Dominic stood up from the chair. He straightened his jacket and walked to the end of the corridor where Brennan was standing and told him what was going to happen to Martin Driscoll by morning, clearly, specifically, without embellishment. Brennan listened, then he said quietly, and the manager thinks he was speaking to a hotel guest. Yes, Dominic said. Brennan was quiet for a moment. He has no idea, he said. No. Dominic agreed. He looked back down the corridor toward the room where a woman slept and a child held her hand, and the rain continued outside, and the night continued its long, slow work of becoming morning. He had no idea at all. Martin Driscoll received the summons at 7:43 in the morning. It arrived through the hotel's internal communication system. A message from the owner's office flagged urgent, requesting his immediate presence in the executive conference room on the second floor. The message was signed by Edmund Ashworth's director of operations, a woman named Margaret Holt, who had worked for the hotel group for 16 years and was known across every property in the portfolio for two things: absolute competence and the complete absence of patience for men who confuse their title with their worth. Driscoll had read the message 3 times. Then he had straightened his jacket and told himself it was routine. Men like Driscoll were skilled at telling themselves things. It was in many ways the primary qualification for the kind of work he had been doing, the quiet lateral work, the work that existed alongside the official work and required its own maintenance. He had been telling himself for 8 months that the arrangement with Nolan was manageable, contained that the money was clean enough, the paperwork tight enough, the woman ordinary enough that no one with real authority would ever look in her direction. He had been telling himself since the previous night that the man in the black suit was simply an agitated guest who would be handled through standard complaint channels and forgotten by morning. He walked into the conference room at 7:51. Dominic was already there. He was standing near the window with his back partially turned, looking out at the gray morning with his hands loosely at his sides. He had changed at some point, a different shirt, same dark jacket, the tattoos still visible at the collar and cuffs. He looked, Driscoll thought, with a confusion he couldn't immediately account for, as though he had not slept and was entirely unbothered by this. Margaret Holt sat at the head of the conference table with a laptop open and a printed file beside it. She did not look up when Driscoll entered. 2 men Driscoll did not recognize stood near the door. He stopped walking when he saw them. Mr. Driscoll, Margaret said, still not looking up. Please sit down. Driscoll sat down. Dominic turned from the window. He moved to the table without hurry and took a seat across from Driscoll, and for a moment said nothing. Simply looked at the man with the same quality of attention he had directed at him the previous night in the lobby. That look that contained no hostility and no warmth, and somehow for that exact reason was worse than either. Margaret turned the laptop to face Driscoll. On the screen were financial records, account numbers, transfer dates, amounts. The intermediary company names that had seemed 8 months ago sufficiently obscured to be invisible, they had not been sufficiently obscured. Driscoll looked at the screen, then at Margaret, then slowly at Dominic. I don't understand what 8 months of payments, Dominic said, received from an intermediary account registered to a facilities contractor that does not exist, originating from a private account held by a man named Keith Nolan. He paused. You know that name? It was not a question. The color had begun leaving Driscoll's face in the specific way that color leaves faces when the body understands something before the mind is ready to. I want to be clear about what this meeting is, Dominic continued. His voice was level, unhurried, carrying the particular calm of a man who had already decided every outcome and was now simply administering the sequence. This is not a negotiation. It is not an opportunity to provide context. It is a notification. He folded his hands on the table. By 9 this morning, Grace Whitfield will have received every withheld wage plus compensation. By 10, your access to every system in this hotel will have been revoked. By 11, you will have been formally separated from your position with cause, and the documentation supporting that separation will be filed with the relevant authorities. Driscoll's mouth opened. The cause, Dominic said, before anything could come out of it, will be recorded accurately. Acceptance of bribes, deliberate manipulation of employee records, complicity in a scheme designed to deprive a seriously ill single mother of her income and ultimately her custody of her child. He let that sit. That will follow you. You can't. Driscoll stopped, recalibrated. Who are you? You're a guest. You have no authority in this. He has every authority in this, Margaret said. She said it without looking up from her laptop. The flatness with which she delivered it was more devastating than any elaboration would have been. Driscoll looked at Dominic. Dominic said nothing. He did not explain himself. He did not reach for a title or a credential. He simply held Driscoll's gaze and allowed the silence to do what silence does when it occupies a room alongside someone who is completely comfortable inside it. It took approximately 11 seconds. Then something in Driscoll's face changed. A collapse. Small but total, like a structure that had been load-bearing, something too heavy for too long, and had finally given way. His eyes moved to the financial records on the laptop screen, to Margaret's expression, to the two men by the door, and then he understood. Not just what was happening in this room, but what he had done the previous night in the lobby, who he had stood in front of and given excuses to and attempted to manage with corporate language and careful deflection. You own, he started. I have interests, Dominic said simply, in many things. The full weight of his miscalculation arrived on Driscoll's face all at once. 8 months of careful construction dismantled overnight, a career revoked before 9, and the man he had dismissed as an agitated guest sitting across a conference table, looking at him with the patient, settled expression of someone for whom this outcome had never been in question. Margaret closed the laptop. Security will escort you to collect your personal items, she said. You have 30 minutes. She stood, gathered the printed file, and left the room. The two men by the door stepped forward. Driscoll stood slowly, like a man whose legs were doing the work his mind had abdicated. He looked at Dominic once more, a final complicated look that contained several things Dominic had no interest in receiving. Then he was gone. Dominic remained seated. He looked at the empty chair across from him and the closed laptop and the morning light coming gray and flat through the conference room window. His phone buzzed, a message from the clinic. Grace Whitfield had woken up. He read it twice. Then he stood straight in his jacket and allowed himself one thing he very rarely allowed, a slow, quiet exhale that carried with it the particular relief of a weight that had been correctly placed down. Driscoll was finished, but there was still someone else, and that conversation would require a very different room. Keith Nolan believed the morning was going well. He had woken at 8, made coffee, checked his phone. Nothing from Driscoll yet, but that wasn't unusual. The man communicated in his own time through channels that maintained comfortable distance between them. Nolan had learned patience over the past 8 months. He had learned to trust the process, the slow grinding process of watching Grace's situation deteriorate, one withheld paycheck at a time, one manufactured absence at a time. He was building a case, not in any courtroom, not yet, but in the architecture of documentation. Every missed shift Driscoll recorded. Every late payment Grace failed to make. Every borrowed dollar from the neighbor. He was constructing a picture, one brushstroke at a time, of a woman who couldn't manage. And when the picture was complete enough to hang in front of a judge, he would walk back into family court with his attorney and his manufactured evidence and take back what that judge had taken from him 18 months ago. He was on his second coffee when the knock came. Not a doorbell. A knock. 3 times. Unhurried, with the specific cadence of someone who was not uncertain about whether they would be answered. Nolan opened the door. 2 men he had never seen stood in the hallway outside his apartment. Large men with the particular stillness of people for whom stillness is professional rather than natural. One of them spoke. "Mr. Nolan, someone would like a word." It was phrased as a courtesy. Nolan understood immediately that it was not one. The meeting took place in a room on the ground floor of a building 12 minutes from Nolan's apartment, a room that belonged nominally to a logistics company Dominic held interest in. It was unremarkable. A table, chairs, a window overlooking a narrow street where the morning traffic moved in gray indifferent streams. Dominic was already seated when Nolan was brought in. Nolan was a broad man, not tall, but built with the particular density of someone who had spent years believing physical size was a form of argument. He had the remnants of good looks and the specific expression of a man accustomed to controlling rooms through a combination of volume and proximity. 2 restraining orders had not adjusted his posture. A lost custody case had not adjusted it. He sat down across from Dominic with his jaw set and his eyes already performing their calculation. "I don't know who you are," Nolan said. "Yes, you do," Dominic said. "You just don't know my name yet." Nolan looked around the room. The 2 men from his doorway were stationed near the exit. He looked back at Dominic, and something in the quality of Dominic's attention, that complete unhurried focus, made the calculation behind his eyes begin running faster. "If this is about Grace, it is about Grace," Dominic said, "and it is about Lily." The name landed differently than Nolan expected. He had anticipated legal language official channels. He had not anticipated the child's name being said in that tone, quiet and direct and carrying the full weight of what that name represented. He shifted in his chair. "I have rights," Nolan said. "Regardless of what Grace has told you, you have legal rights regarding my daughter." "You had legal rights," Dominic said. "You spent them on a bribery scheme." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think you—" "Martin Driscoll was dismissed this morning," Dominic said, "with documented cause. The financial records connecting his payments to your accounts have been filed. The communications between you have been recovered." A single beat. Sawyer is very thorough. The name meant nothing to Nolan, but the word recovered did. Dominic watched him absorb it the specific way a man absorbs information that rearranges everything he thought was secured. The set jaw remained, but something behind the eyes had changed. "You don't have—" "I have everything," Dominic said simply. "I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you what happens next." He held Nolan's gaze with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. "What happens next is this. The documentation goes to your custody attorney, to the family court, and to the financial crimes unit. Your visitation rights, what remained of them, will be reviewed in light of a deliberate, sustained conspiracy to endanger your child's welfare." He paused. "Because that is what it was. You engineered the exhaustion and financial collapse of the only stable parent Lily has. You used your daughter as leverage. That is what the documentation shows, and that is what it will say." Nolan said nothing. His hands on the table were very still. "That is the legal consequence," Dominic continued. "I am not here to deliver legal consequences. I am here to deliver a personal one." He leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just closing the distance enough that what he said next could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. "Stay away from Grace Whitfield. Stay away from Lily. Remove yourself from their lives completely and permanently. Do not contact them. Do not approach them. Do not instruct anyone else to do so on your behalf." A pause. "This is the only time I will say this." Nolan stared at him. "You can't enforce—" "I'm not enforcing anything," Dominic said. "I'm informing you." He leaned back. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature throughout the entire conversation. It did not change now. "You built a careful plan over 8 months. You found a man with manageable debts. You moved money through channels you believed were invisible, and you slowly, deliberately pushed a sick woman toward collapse while her 6-year-old daughter sat on a bench in a hotel lobby at midnight holding a purple backpack." He stopped. That plan arrived at me. I need you to understand what that means. The room was very quiet. Nolan was not a man who frightened easily. Dominic knew the type, had known many of them across many rooms. Men whose sense of themselves was so heavily constructed that fear had to find unusual entry points. It couldn't come through the front door because the front door was barricaded with ego and entitlement and years of never being made to answer for anything in a way that stuck. It had found one. Dominic could see it. In the stillness of those hands on the table, in the way Nolan's eyes had stopped performing their calculation and had simply gone flat and present in the way eyes go when a person is receiving something they cannot yet process but cannot deny receiving. Lily will not grow up wondering where her stability went, Dominic said quietly. She will not grow up watching her mother rebuild from nothing because someone decided she was useful as a point of pressure. He paused one final time. You are going to let them go completely. And you are going to do it because you have understood this morning in this room that the alternative is not something you want to investigate. Nolan said nothing for a long moment. His eyes remained on Dominic's face, searching for something, a bluff, a weakness, a gap in the architecture. He found none. Then he looked down at his hands on the table. Something moved across his face. Not remorse, not exactly, but the particular deflation of a man whose architecture has been systematically taken apart and who is sitting in the rubble of it without anything left to hide behind. There won't be any more contact, he said finally. His voice was flat, stripped of its performance. Dominic looked at him for one more moment. Then he stood. He did not extend a hand. He did not offer a closing remark. He simply left. Outside, the morning had not improved. Still gray, still damp. The city going about its Tuesday with the complete indifference cities maintain toward the private catastrophes occurring inside their buildings. Dominic walked to the car and got in and sat for a moment looking at the street. Brennan in the driver's seat did not ask how it had gone. After a while, Dominic said, "The clinic." Brennan pulled out. Dominic looked out the window at the gray city moving past and thought about a little girl who had learned how to wait alone, who had learned to fold granola bar wrappers into precise small squares, who had looked at a stranger's face in a hotel lobby and decided with her mother's taught assessment that he was safe. He thought about what it would mean for her to grow up without that weight, to simply grow up. He looked at the rain on the window. Faster, he said quietly. Brennan accelerated. And Dominic Hale, who had spent 19 years moving through a city that spoke his name carefully, sat in the front seat of a car at 10 in the morning and felt something unfamiliar occupying the space in his chest where the tension of the last 12 hours had been. It took him a moment to identify it. It was the specific uncommon quiet of a thing that had been wrong for a long time being made right. He did not examine it too closely, but he did not push it away either. He let it stay. Grace woke to the sound of Lily breathing. It was the first thing she registered, before the unfamiliar ceiling, before the medical equipment, before the soft ambient light of a room that was clearly not her own. Lily's breathing, the small even rhythm of it close by, completely relaxed in the way children's breathing is relaxed when they feel genuinely safe. Grace turned her head. Lily was asleep in the chair beside the bed, head resting on her folded arms at the mattress edge, her purple backpack on the floor beneath the chair, her hands still loosely holding Grace's, even in sleep. Grace looked at her daughter for a long time without moving. The last clear memory she had was the hotel suite, the cleaning trolley, the floor coming up to meet her, the specific quality of her own exhaustion when it had finally, after weeks of being refused, simply taken what it was owed. She remembered thinking in that descending moment, not about herself, but about Lily waiting in the staff room, whether she had enough of the granola bars, whether she was frightened. She had not allowed herself to think about how bad it had gotten until the floor. The floor had made the decision for her. She became aware gradually of how she felt, which was weak in the thorough deep tissue way that signals the body has finally stopped performing and has begun the quiet work of repair. Her head was clear despite the weakness. An IV line ran to her left arm. The room was warm. She had no idea how she had arrived here. She was trying to reconstruct it carefully when the door opened. Dominic stepped in quietly. He was in the same dark jacket. He looked like a man who had covered significant distance since they had last occupied the same space and who had covered it entirely on his own terms. He stopped when he saw her eyes open. "You're awake," he said. "Yes." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. "I've been trying to work out how I got here." "My car," Dominic said. She looked at him. "You carried me out of the hotel." "You walked," he said, "with assistance." A pause. Grace looked down at Lily still sleeping against the mattress edge. Her throat tightened in the specific way it tightened when she was managing something large and did not have the resources to manage it with anything but control. "She stayed all night," Dominic said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "She didn't leave the chair." Grace pressed her lips together briefly, looked at the ceiling, looked back at her daughter. "She does that," she said quietly. "She stays." "I know," Dominic said. He moved to the chair near the window, not the one Lily occupied, the one angled slightly further away, and sat down with the particular ease of a man who had decided the room was where he needed to be and saw no reason to qualify it. Grace looked at him properly for the first time. In the hotel, she had only registered impressions. The dark suit, the tattoos, the steadiness. Now she looked at him the way she looked at things when she had sufficient stillness and to actually see them. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "No." Dominic agreed. "Then why did you—" He considered the question with a seriousness that suggested he was not going to offer her the comfortable deflecting answer. "Because your daughter looked up at me," he said finally, "and I recognized something." Grace waited. "The way she was sitting," he said. "The way she knew how to wait." He paused. "My mother used to work nights, cleaning." He said it without elaboration, without performance, simply as a fact. "I sat in waiting rooms and lobbies when I was not much older than Lily. I knew how to wait too." Grace was very still. "I am not the same kind of person your mother was," she said carefully. "No," Dominic said, "but Lily is the same kind of child I was, and no one made a phone call for my mother." He looked at his hands briefly. "I had a phone. It seemed like a reasonable use of it." The room was quiet. Outside, the rain had finally, after its long night of persistence, begun to ease. Grace looked at her daughter sleeping with her hand still holding hers, and felt something move through her that was too large and too complex to name in any single word. Gratitude was in it, and relief, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been strong for a very long time and has just been told for perhaps the first time that they are allowed to stop. Her eyes filled. She did not try to prevent it. "The wages have been transferred," Dominic said quietly, "all of them plus compensation. The manager was dismissed this morning. The owner of the hotel has asked that I convey his personal apology for what that is worth." Grace absorbed this. Then something in Dominic's tone, not what he had said, but what he was preparing to say, made her go very still. "Nolan will not be a problem," Dominic said. The way he said it required no further explanation. Grace understood, with the instinctive comprehension of a person who had spent years reading the difference between promises and certainties, that this was a certainty. She exhaled, long and slow, and carrying in it the compressed weight of 8 months. Then something changed in her face. Not relief this time. Something harder. Something that had been forming beneath the exhaustion and the fear for longer than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. "He was doing this on purpose," she said. "It was not a question. Keith, the wages, the pressure, all of it." Dominic looked at her steadily. "Yes." "He was trying to take Lily." "Yes." Grace's jaw set. It was a small movement, but Dominic recognized it because he had seen it in a different context entirely, in the faces of people who had been knocked down and had just discovered in the process of hitting the floor that they had more fight in them than they knew. "He filed a petition," Grace said. "Didn't he, or he was about to?" Dominic said nothing. He did not need to. Grace looked at the ceiling for a long moment. When she looked back, her eyes were dry. The tears had been replaced by something else, something that had edges. "I need a lawyer," she said. "I can arrange, though." "No." She said it clearly, without hesitation. "I need my lawyer, the one from the custody case. Patricia Kessler. She knows the history. She knows what he is." She sat up slightly in the bed. The IV pulled, and she adjusted it without looking at it. "I'm not going to let someone else fight this for me," she said. "Not this. This is mine." Dominic looked at her. For the first time since the lobby, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, recognition. The recognition of a quality he had not been certain she possessed until this moment, and which changed the geometry of everything he had planned to do next. I'll make sure you have what you need, he said. The financial records, the payment trails, everything Sawyer found. Sawyer, the man who discovered the arrangement between Nolan and Driscoll. His documentation is thorough. It will hold up. Grace met his eyes. You're giving me the evidence. I'm giving you the weapons, Dominic said. The fight is yours. Lily stirred at the sound of their voices. Her eyes opened unfocused briefly, then found her mother's face with the instant, complete relief of a child whose internal compass had been pointing in one direction all night and had finally found true north. Mommy, she sat up, you're awake. I'm awake, baby, Grace said. Lily stood from the chair and climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed and fitted herself against her mother's side with a wholeness of commitment that left no room for ambiguity. Grace's arm came around her, her face pressed into Lily's hair. Dominic looked at the window. He gave them the privacy of his attention being elsewhere, which was the most private thing he could offer in a room this size. After a while, Lily's voice came slightly muffled against her mother's side. I told you he would help, she said. Grace made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. Yes, she said softly. You did. 3 days passed. Grace Whitfield spent them in the clinic, not because the physician insisted, but because her body, having finally been given permission to stop, took the permission seriously. It shut down systems that had been running on emergency reserves for weeks. It demanded sleep in quantities that embarrassed her. It demanded stillness in a woman who had not been still since before Christmas. Lily stayed. She stayed the way she stayed, everywhere completely without negotiation, with the purple backpack on the floor beside whatever chair she had claimed, and her small hands occupied with whatever task she had assigned herself. She drew. She read a book the nurse had found for her. She ate meals that arrived on trays with a seriousness that suggested she was evaluating the clinic's food service and finding it adequate but not exceptional. On the second day, she asked Grace if the granola bars at the clinic were different from the ones at home. They're the same kind, Grace said. They taste different here, Lily said. She thought about it. I think it's because I'm not on the bench. Grace looked at her daughter and felt something crack inside her chest that she had been holding together with willpower and denial for 8 months. She pulled Lily close and pressed her face into her daughter's hair and breathed and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have broken the fragile calm they had both constructed to survive in. On the third day, Grace made 2 phone calls. The first was to Patricia Kessler. Patricia Kessler was 57 years old, had practiced family law for 29 years, and operated out of a small firm on Bleecker Street that she had founded after leaving a corporate practice she described when asked as a place where they valued billing hours more than people's children. She had represented Grace in the original custody case. She had been the one to present the evidence of Keith Nolan's behavior to the family court. She had stood beside Grace in the hallway after the ruling and said with a particular directness that was her professional signature, "He's going to come back. Men like him always come back. When he does call me first." Grace called her first. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Grace told her everything: the withheld wages, the manufactured absences, Driscoll, the payments Sawyer had traced, the custody petition Nolan had been preparing. She told it the way she had learned to tell difficult things clearly, sequentially, without embellishment, the way a person tells a story when they understand that the facts are sufficient and do not require decoration. Patricia listened without interrupting. Then she asked 4 questions, each one precise, each one aimed at a specific structural point in the legal architecture that Nolan had been assembling. Then she said, "Send me everything you have, all of it, every document, every record, every piece of paper with a number on it. I want it by tomorrow morning." "You'll have it tonight," Grace said. "Good." A pause. "Grace?" "Yes." "You should have called me sooner." "I know. Don't do that again. Don't carry things alone when you have people who can carry them with you." Grace closed her eyes briefly. "I won't." "Good. I'll file a motion by end of week. We're not waiting for him to come to us. We're going to him." The second phone call was to Dominic. He answered on the second ring. He did not say hello. He said, "How are you feeling?" "Better," Grace said. "I spoke to my lawyer." "Kessler." "You looked her up." Sawyer looked her up. "She's good." "She's the best," Grace said. There was something in her voice that had not been there 3 days ago. A firmness, a directionality. The voice of a woman who had located somewhere beneath the exhaustion in the fear of the part of herself that Keith Nolan had been trying to destroy and had found it intact. Bruised, tired, but structurally sound. "I need the documents," she said. "Everything Sawyer found. The payment, records, the communications, the account structures, all of it." "It'll be delivered to Kessler's office this afternoon," Dominic said. A pause. "Thank you," Grace said, "for not trying to do this for me." Dominic was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice held something that was not softness, but was adjacent to it, a room next to it with the connecting door left open. "You didn't need me to do it for you," he said. "You needed the floor to stop moving long enough to stand up. The floor has stopped moving." Grace said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It has." "Then stand up," Dominic said. "You already know how." He ended the call. Grace held the phone in her hands and looked at the window where the morning light was coming in pale and steady the first morning in 3 days without rain, and she thought about standing up. Not metaphorically, literally. She thought about putting her feet on the floor and bearing her own weight and walking forward under her own power into whatever came next. She put her feet on the floor. She stood. Patricia Kessler moved with the particular velocity of a woman who had been waiting 18 months for this phone call and had spent those 18 months keeping one eye on the calendar and one hand on the file. The motion she filed was not defensive. It was not a response to Nolan's anticipated petition. It was a preemptive strike filed before Nolan's attorney had finished drafting his paperwork requesting an emergency review of Keith Nolan's parental rights in light of newly discovered evidence of financial manipulation, witness tampering, and a sustained campaign to undermine the custodial parent's ability to provide for her child. The motion was 17 pages long. It was accompanied by 43 pages of financial documentation provided by Sawyer, authenticated by a forensic accountant Patricia had retained within hours of Grace's phone call. It included the payment records between Nolan and Driscoll, the intermediary account structures, the communications recovered from Driscoll's devices, and a timeline that mapped with devastating precision the correlation between Nolan's payments and Grace's deteriorating circumstances. Nolan's attorney received the filing on a Monday afternoon. By Monday evening, he had called Keith Nolan and told him in the measured language attorneys use when they are delivering very bad news that the landscape had changed substantially. Nolan did not take this well. He called Driscoll's number. Disconnected. He called it again. Still disconnected. He called the Ashworth Grand and was told that Mr. Driscoll was no longer employed at the hotel. He sat in his apartment with his phone in his hand and felt the specific vertigo of a man watching the walls he had built begin to lean inward. He called his attorney back and told him to fight it. His attorney paused for exactly 3 seconds, which in legal terms was the equivalent of a very long sigh. "Keith," the attorney said, "I need you to understand what we're looking at. The documentation they filed is comprehensive. The financial trail is clear. The forensic analysis is authenticated. If we go into that courtroom and contest this, we are going to lose, and we are going to lose in a way that creates additional legal exposure for you. Criminal exposure." "I have rights," Nolan said. He said it the way he had said it in every room he had ever occupied where his authority was being questioned, as a declaration, as a foundational truth, as though the words themselves spoken with sufficient conviction could restructure reality around them. "You had rights," the attorney said. "This documentation suggests you forfeited them through a deliberate pattern of conduct. My recommendation strongly is that we negotiate." "I'm not negotiating about my daughter." "Keith," the attorney's voice dropped, "you're not negotiating about your daughter. You're negotiating about whether this stays in family court or moves to criminal proceedings. That is the actual question on the table." Nolan was silent for a long time. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. It arrived with the indifferent punctuality that Thursdays maintain, regardless of what is scheduled to occur within them. Grace Whitfield walked into the courthouse at 9:12 in the morning. She wore a navy blue dress she had bought 2 days earlier the first piece of clothing she had purchased for herself in 7 months. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were steady. She carried a folder that contained nothing she would need to reference because she had read every page so many times that the words existed in her memory as architecture as the load-bearing walls of the case she was about to present. Patricia Kessler walked beside her. Patricia wore gray, carried a briefcase that had seen the inside of more courtrooms than most attorneys would see in 2 careers, and had the expression of a woman who had spent 29 years waiting for cases exactly like this one. Lily was not in the courthouse. She was at Mrs. Pemberton's house, next door, eating pancakes and drawing pictures, and being for one morning simply a 6-year-old girl whose only concerns were whether the syrup bottle was within reach and whether the purple crayon was the right shade of purple for what she had in mind. Grace had kissed her that morning and held her for a moment longer than usual and said, "I'll be back before lunch." Lily had looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "I know." The courtroom was smaller than Grace remembered from the first custody hearing. Or perhaps she had been smaller, then compressed by fear and shame and the particular diminishment that comes from standing in a room and asking strangers to believe you about the person who was supposed to love you. She had been smaller in every way that mattered. Smaller in her certainty, smaller in her voice, smaller in her belief that the story she was telling would be heard and acted upon. She was not small now. Keith Nolan was already seated when Grace entered. He sat at the respondent's table with his attorney beside him, and his jaw set in the particular configuration she recognized from years of living with him. The configuration that meant he was performing strength because he felt weakness and could not tolerate the feeling. He did not look at her when she walked in. Grace looked at him. She looked at him fully directly, without the flinch that his presence had once triggered in her nervous system. She looked at him the way Lily looked at things with assessment, with the clear, unhurried evaluation of someone determining what a thing actually was, as opposed to what it presented itself to be. What she saw was a man sitting in a chair. That was all. The judge entered. The Honorable Richard Colton, 64 years old, 31 years on the bench. A man known in family court circles for 2 qualities that existed in productive tension with each other: deep compassion for children and absolute intolerance for adults who use them as instruments. The proceedings opened with Patricia's motion. She presented it with clinical precision, walking the court through the financial records, the payments from Nolan to Driscoll, the intermediary accounts, the timeline of Grace's deteriorating circumstances mapped against the timeline of Nolan's deposits. She presented the communications recovered from Driscoll's devices. She presented the forensic accountant's report. She did not raise her voice. She did not make emotional appeals. She let the numbers do what numbers do when they are arranged in the correct order and pointed in the correct direction. Then she said, "Your Honor, the respondent orchestrated an 8-month campaign designed to financially and physically destroy the petitioner's ability to care for her child with the explicit intention of using that manufactured destruction as grounds for a custody modification. The documentation is comprehensive, authenticated, and unambiguous. We respectfully request that the court terminate the respondent's remaining parental rights, their entirety." Nolan's attorney stood. He was a competent man in a bad position, and he did what competent men in bad positions do. He questioned the provenance of the financial records. He questioned the chain of custody of the recovered communications. He suggested that the intermediary accounts could have legitimate explanations that had not been explored. He did this with the professional thoroughness of a man who understood he was building a sandcastle below the tide line and was doing his best work anyway. Judge Colton listened to all of it. Then he looked at Grace. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'd like to hear from you." Grace stood. She felt the eyes of the courtroom on her. She felt Keith's eyes on her for the first time since she had entered. She felt Patricia's steady presence beside her. She felt the weight of 8 months pressing against the back of her throat. She set the folder down. She did not need it. "Your Honor," she said, 8 months ago I was a woman with a crate, an apartment, and a daughter who slept through the night because she knew that when she woke up I would be there." She paused, not for effect, because the next sentence required her to be ready for it. 6 days ago I was on the floor of a hotel room at 1 in the morning, too sick to stand up, while my 6-year-old daughter sat alone in the lobby, holding a purple backpack because she didn't want to be in an empty room by herself. The courtroom was very quiet. I didn't know why my wages had been withheld. I didn't know why every time I called to ask, I was told it was my fault. I didn't know why every shift got harder and every week got more impossible and every morning felt like trying to climb a wall that someone kept building higher while I slept. She looked at Keith directly, without flinching. Now I know he did it. He paid someone to do it. He paid someone to take my money and document my sick days as failures and threaten my job and watch me fall apart one piece at a time so he could walk into this courtroom and say I wasn't fit to raise my daughter. Her voice did not waver. My daughter, who sat on a bench in a hotel lobby at midnight and told a complete stranger that her mommy was sick and her boss wouldn't pay her. My daughter who folds granola bar wrappers into neat little squares because I taught her to be tidy. My daughter who pays attention to people's faces because I taught her that faces tell you things words don't. She paused. I taught her those things. I taught her while I was sick, while I was scared, while I was borrowing money from my neighbor to pack her lunch. I taught her every single day because that is what I do. That is what I have always done. And no amount of withheld paychecks or manufactured absences or carefully routed bribes is going to change the fact that I am her mother and I am standing here and I am not going anywhere. She looked at Judge Colton. I am asking this court to protect my daughter from a man who looked at her and saw a thing to be won. She is not a thing to be won. She is a child. She is my child. And she deserves to grow up without looking over her shoulder. Grace sat down. The courtroom was silent. Patricia Kessler, who had spent 29 years in courtrooms and had heard thousands of statements from thousands of parents, sat very still beside her client and said nothing. There was nothing to add. Judge Colton looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at Nolan. He looked at Nolan's attorney. He looked at Grace. Then he spoke. The evidence before this court is clear, comprehensive, and deeply disturbing. The respondent engaged in a deliberate, sustained, and well-documented campaign to undermine the petitioner's financial stability, physical health, and parental capacity using a third-party intermediary who was positioned within the petitioner's place of employment. The purpose of this campaign, as demonstrated by the financial records, the recovered communications, and the timeline of events, was to manufacture the conditions for a custody modification that the respondent could not obtain through legitimate means. He paused. This court does not take the termination of parental rights lightly. It is the most severe action available in family law, and it is reserved for circumstances in which a parent has demonstrated through sustained conduct that their involvement in a child's life constitutes a clear and present danger to that child's welfare. He looked directly at Keith Nolan. Mr. Nolan, your conduct meets that standard. You did not merely fail your daughter. You weaponized her. You treated her welfare as a strategic variable in a campaign designed to harm her mother. This court finds that your remaining parental rights are hereby terminated in their entirety. You are ordered to have no contact, direct or indirect, with the minor child. Any violation of this order will result in immediate criminal contempt proceedings. He looked at Grace. Mrs. Whitfield, this court commends your strength and your devotion to your daughter. Full custody is affirmed and made permanent. He closed the file. We are adjourned. Grace sat in the courtroom for a full minute after the judge left. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and her eyes on the wood grain and her breathing slow and deliberate and the tears running down her face in two straight lines that she did not wipe away because wiping them away would have required her to move, and moving would have required her to leave this moment, and she was not ready to leave this moment. Patricia put a hand on her shoulder and said nothing. Keith Nolan left the courtroom without looking at her. His attorney walked beside him, speaking in low tones. The door closed behind them. The room was empty except for Grace and Patricia and the clerk filing paperwork, and the particular quality of silence that exists in a room where something permanent has just occurred. Grace looked up. I need to get home, she said. I told Lily I'd be back before lunch. She drove home with the windows down despite the cold. The air coming in smelled like the city and early spring exhaust and wet pavement, and something underneath both of those things that might have been the first tentative suggestion of warmth. She parked in front of her building and sat in the car for a moment, with her hands on the steering wheel, and looked at the front door of Mrs. Pemberton's ground floor apartment, where a small face was already visible in the window watching for her. Grace got out of the car. Lily was at the door before Grace reached the steps. She came out in her socks, which Grace would normally have corrected, and she crossed the cold concrete and pressed herself against her mother's legs with everything she had. The full-body certainty of a child who has been waiting and has decided the waiting is over. Grace crouched down. She held her daughter's face in both hands and looked at her. "It's done, baby," she said. "It's all done." Lily looked at her with those steady dark eyes. She studied her mother's face the way she studied all faces, reading what was written there, assessing what the words meant and what existed in the spaces between them. "You were brave," Lily said. It was not a question. It was a determination she had reached through her own analysis. Grace laughed. It came out wet and uneven, and she didn't care. She said. "I really was." "I know," Lily said. "I can tell from your face." 3 weeks later, Grace Whitfield walked into the Ashworth Grand Hotel for her first day in the guest relations department. The lobby was unchanged. The chandelier cast the same warm geometry across the same marble floors. The reception desk was staffed with the same careful professionalism. The table lamps burned at their same calibrated warmth. The building had continued indifferently through everything that had happened inside it, the way buildings do, the way cities do, the way the world does, while people are busy surviving it. But Grace was not the same person who had cleaned its floors. The position had opened quietly in the week following Driscoll's dismissal. Margaret Holt had called Grace directly. The conversation had been brief and without ceremony. "The position is available. The salary is specified. The start date is at your discretion given your recovery." Grace had listened to all of it and then asked one question. "Why me?" Margaret had paused for exactly 1 second. "Because you came to work when you shouldn't have had to," she said. "That tells me what I need to know." Grace had started on a Tuesday. Lily came with her that first morning. It was a school holiday, and Grace was not yet comfortable with the idea of unnecessary distance between them. Lily wore her olive green jacket and carried the purple backpack and walked through the hotel entrance with the particular gravity of a child revisiting a place that holds significant personal history. She stopped at the wooden bench near the glass wall, looked at it for a moment, then looked up at her mother. "This is where I sat," she said. "I know," Grace said. Lily studied the bench with an expression that was difficult to read, something between solemnity and a quiet pride, as though the bench represented something she had done that she understood in retrospect to have mattered. A decision she had made on a rainy Tuesday night that had set something in motion that was larger than she could fully comprehend, but that she could feel the shape of. Then she moved on. Grace was shown to her workspace by a colleague named Florina, who was warm and efficient and asked no questions about the circumstances that had preceded Grace's arrival in this role. Grace was grateful for this. She was learning carefully how to exist in this building as something other than invisible. It was not simple. The floors she walked were the same floors she had cleaned. The suites upstairs were the same suites. The service corridors existed behind the walls she now moved in front of. There were moments, small private moments, when she felt the weight of that double geography pressing against her composure. She moved through them the way she had moved through harder things, one breath at a time. Dominic arrived at the hotel at 11. He came the way he always came, without announcement, with Brennan a few paces behind, with the unhurried quality of a man whose relationship with time was one of mutual respect rather than competition. He was there for a meeting on the 14th floor, a different meeting than the one he had never made it to, on a different matter entirely. He crossed the lobby. He was nearly at the elevator when he heard his name. Not his full name, not Mr. Hale, or the careful half-whisper that usually carried his name in spaces like this. Just Dominic. He turned. Lily was standing near the reception desk, backpack on jacket slightly askew from what appeared to have been a rapid movement across the lobby. She was looking at him with those steady dark eyes, and the expression he had come to understand was her version of restrained excitement, which was in Lily's particular emotional vocabulary approximately equivalent to anyone else's unbridled joy. He stopped walking. She crossed the remaining distance between them with the focused purpose she brought to everything, stopping in front of him and looking up. "You came," she said, as though his presence required acknowledgement before anything else could proceed. "I have a meeting," he said. "I know." She nodded seriously. "Mommy said you have meetings here sometimes." "I do." She studied him for a moment. Then she reached into the front pocket of her backpack and produced something which she held out to him with both hands in the grave formality of someone presenting something of genuine significance. It was a drawing, crayon on white paper folded twice. He took it and opened it carefully. It depicted with the confident economy of a child's hand a hotel lobby. The chandelier was suggested by a yellow circle with lines radiating outward. The floor was rendered in careful parallel lines. On one side of the drawing, a small figure sat on a brown rectangle that was clearly a bench. The figure had a purple backpack. On the other side, a taller figure crouched down. The taller figure had lines on its hands and neck. Between them, in Lily's careful, oversized handwriting, "The man who saved my mommy." Dominic looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked at Lily. She was watching him with that patient, evaluating gaze, waiting to see what he did with it. Not nervously. She was not a nervous child, had never been a nervous child, had simply been a child who had learned to wait and watch and assess with a precision that had nothing to do with her age. "Thank you," he said. "You can keep it," she said generously. "I intend to." He folded it carefully with the same precision she had applied to the granola bar wrapper on the lobby bench and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Lily watched this with evident satisfaction. Grace appeared from across the lobby, slightly breathless, with the expression of a mother who has briefly lost visual contact with her child in a public space and is managing the resulting adrenaline with composure. "Lily." She arrived beside her daughter and looked at Dominic. Something moved across her face. Relief and gratitude, and something beyond both of those things. Something that had to do with the distance between where she had been and where she was standing now, and the particular fact that she had covered most of that distance herself. "She saw you from the desk," Grace said. "I couldn't stop her." "I noticed," Dominic said. "I hope she didn't." "She gave me something," Dominic said. He touched the inside pocket of his jacket briefly. "It was worth stopping for." Grace looked at him for a moment. Her face was different than it had been in the clinic. The pallor was gone. The dark circles had faded. But it was more than the physical recovery. There was something behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, a settledness, the particular quality of a person who has been through the worst thing and has come out standing and now knows with the certainty that only comes from direct experience that she can. "She talks about you," Grace said finally. "At home. She tells people, her teacher, Mrs. Pemberton next door. She tells them about the man from the hotel." "What does she tell them?" Grace smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile without exhaustion behind it, without fear beneath it. This smile was just a smile, simple and complete and bearing only its own weight. "She tells them you were sitting in the right place," Grace said. "She says you had a phone and it was a reasonable use of it." Dominic was quiet. "She listens," Grace said gently. "Yes," he said. "She does." He looked across the lobby, at the wooden bench near the glass wall, at the chandelier light across the marble floors, at the windows through which the city showed this morning in pale spring sun rather than gray rain, the city that spoke his name carefully, the city that knew what he was. He thought about a drawing folded in his inside pocket, crayon lines on white paper, a bench, two figures, the careful, oversized handwriting of a child who had decided without hesitation what he was to her. Not the same thing the city decided. Something smaller. Something that required no fear to sustain it and no power to maintain it and no careful management of anyone's perception. Just a bench, two figures, and the honest assessment of a 6-year-old girl who paid attention to faces. "Go back to your desk," Dominic told Grace. "You have work to do." Grace looked at him. The smile remained. "I do." "Lily," Dominic said. Lily looked up. "Eat something. You've been running across lobbies." "I had breakfast," she said with a defensive dignity that suggested the quality and quantity of her breakfast was not a matter for public discussion. "Have second breakfast," he said. Lily considered this. "Is that a real thing?" "It is now." Lily looked at her mother for confirmation. Grace shrugged. Lily appeared to accept this new breakfast doctrine with the seriousness it deserved. "Okay," she said. Then she looked at Dominic once more with that steady, direct gaze, the gaze that had stopped him in the lobby on a rainy Tuesday night. the gaze that had redirected the entire course of what followed simply by being honest and unafraid. "Bye, Dominic," she said. "Goodbye, Lily." She turned and walked back across the lobby with her backpack and her gravity and her olive green jacket and did not look back. Because Lily Whitfield, at 6 years old, had already learned that you didn't need to look back at things you trusted to still be there. Dominic watched her go. Beside him, Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she touched his arm briefly, the lightest touch barely there, the kind of contact that exists not to communicate information, but to acknowledge a connection that had been formed in a lobby at midnight and had held. Then she followed her daughter. Dominic stood alone in the lobby of the Ashworth Grand. The chandelier light fell across the marble. The staff moved in their quiet orbits. The elevator waited at the far end with its soft mechanical patience. He reached into his jacket and touched the folded drawing against his chest. He felt the paper through the fabric. He felt the weight of it, which was nothing measurable, nothing that any instrument could detect, and was simultaneously the heaviest and lightest thing he had carried in 19 years. He thought about his mother, about the night shifts and the refolded things and the wages that came late and the phone calls no one made. He thought about a bench and a child and a rainy Tuesday and the specific unrepeatable moment when a man walking toward an elevator in a hotel lobby turned his head and saw something small and still and wrong and stopped. He had stopped. That was the thing. In a life built on forward motion on the next room and the next decision and the relentless momentum of a man who had learned never to pause because pausing invited the kind of reflection that could paralyze, he had stopped. For a child on a bench, for a granola bar eaten in careful bites, for a pair of steady dark eyes that had looked up at him without fear and decided he was safe. He had stopped. And everything that followed had followed from that single deviation. That one moment where the current of his life had encountered something it could not flow around and had been redirected permanently into a channel it had not known existed. Dominic Hale straightened his jacket. He walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors closed around him, and he rode upward through the quiet building with a drawing folded against his chest, and he did not examine too closely the fact that it was, without question, the most valuable thing he was carrying. He did not need to examine it. He already knew.